What if the most famous monster story in literary history was not really about monsters at all? What if it was about loneliness? What if it was about rage? And what if the bride, who was created to satisfy a man's loneliness, decided that she didn't belong to anyone? That is the terrifying and fascinating question at the center of The Bride, the ambitious, gothic romantic horror musical written and directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal. The film is a bold reimagining of the legacy of Mary Shelley, the author who created Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, in 1818, a novel that essentially gave birth to modern science fiction and explored one of humanity's oldest fears. But instead of retelling the monster myth in a traditional way, The Bride transforms it into something closer to a punk gothic psychological opera. It is horror, it is romance, it is crime drama, and yes, it is also a musical. The movie begins in a haunting black and white void. Here we meet the ghost of Mary Shelley, played by Jessie Buckley, who serves multiple roles throughout the film. Shelley explains something unsettling. She claims she always wanted to write a sequel to Frankenstein that was scarier than the original. Not scarier through monsters, but scarier through emotional truth. She speaks directly to the audience, breaking the fourth wall, telling us that the story we are about to watch is the version she was never allowed to publish during her life. This narrative device is controversial but fascinating because it raises a disturbing philosophical question. Can a dead author still possess her story, or is the story now possessed by the filmmaker? Buckley performs an extraordinary triple character role. She plays Mary Shelley, the angry ghost narrator, Ida, the human woman living in 1930s society, and the bride, the resurrected gothic rebel. The film treats these identities almost like psychological layers rather than separate characters. The concept resembles possession mythology. Shelley's spirit occasionally leaks into Ida's speech patterns. Sometimes Ida suddenly speaks in an old British literary cadence, as if history itself is trying to rewrite her. This idea is intentionally surreal. It represents how women's voices have historically been filtered through male-controlled storytelling. The main story is set in 1930s Chicago, during the post-Prohibition gangster era. The city is portrayed as morally decaying and socially violent. This historical environment is important because the film uses crime culture as a metaphor for patriarchal institutional power. Early in the story, Ida is introduced as a woman trapped inside male social spaces. She is surrounded by predatory men who treat her as disposable entertainment. Her death is not accidental, it is symbolic. Ida is pushed down a staircase after being targeted by criminal violence. Her fall represents the historical marginalization of women inside oppressive social structures. Meanwhile, the lonely creature known as Frank, played by Christian Bale, travels across America searching for meaning. Frank is a reinterpretation of Frankenstein's monster, but unlike many modern versions, he is emotionally closer to the original 1930s cinematic monster. He is not evil, he is emotionally underdeveloped. Frank suffers from extreme isolation. There is a heartbreaking scene where he reveals that he has lived for over a century without ever shaking someone's hand. That small detail becomes one of the film's most devastating lines, because it symbolizes social exclusion in its purest form. Frank seeks help from Dr. Euphronius, played by Annette Bening. Dr. Euphronius is not portrayed as a stereotypical mad scientist. Instead, she is sympathetic to lonely creatures. Together, Frank and the doctor perform illegal resurrection surgery. They dig up Ida's corpse. Electricity flows through mechanical laboratory equipment. The film visually references classic Gothic cinema laboratory imagery. When Ida returns to life, black chemical fluid stains the side of her mouth like dark lipstick, a visual symbol of rebellion. The bride awakens without remembering her past. This is extremely important because the film is not interested in traditional revenge storytelling. Instead, it explores the terrifying freedom of not knowing who you were. At first, she tolerates Frank's emotional attachment. Frank is not a romantic predator. He is childlike. He wants companionship more than sexuality. He idolizes movie musical star Ronnie Reed, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Frank studies cinema like a survival manual for social behavior. He believes romantic etiquette can be learned from movie screens. This is one of the film's most tragic comedic elements. After resurrection, the story shifts into something resembling a gothic crime road film. The bride and Frank begin moving across America, leaving bodies behind during moments of violent chaos. Their relationship evolves into something resembling a twisted version of Bonnie and Clyde-style outlaw romance. Detective characters enter the story. Jake Wiles, played by Peter Sarsgaard. Myrna Mallow, played by Penelope Cruz. Myrna Mallow is secretly the intellectual force behind the investigation. The film uses her character to comment on historical misogyny inside law enforcement. The bride eventually becomes a symbol of female resistance. Women across the country begin copying her black cheek mark. This becomes a social movement. However, the film intentionally keeps the revolution abstract. We never see a clearly defined political manifesto. Instead, the rebellion represents emotional rejection of patriarchal expectation rather than organized ideological uprising. Some critics view this as thematic weakness. Others interpret it as deliberate ambiguity. The ending of The Bride is deliberately ambiguous and chaotic, reflecting the film's philosophy that stories about identity and freedom should not be resolved neatly. In the final act, the narrative threads involving crime gangs, police pursuit, feminist rebellion imagery, and romantic tragedy all converge into a visually overwhelming confrontation. But instead of providing a clear heroic victory or villain defeat, the film dissolves into symbolic storytelling. As the revolution inspired by The Bride spreads, the film stops treating the social movement as a traditional political uprising. The women who imitate the bride's black cheek mark are not shown forming an organized resistance army. Instead, the movement exists as emotional solidarity, a shared rejection of violence and patriarchal control rather than a structured ideological system. This is important because the film is not trying to present revolution as a historical outcome. It is presenting rebellion as psychological liberation. The relationship between Frank, played by Christian Bale, and the bride, played by Jessie Buckley, reaches its emotional climax rather than a plot climax. Their romance is never framed as a perfect fairy tale. Instead, it is shown as the connection between two beings who were rejected by society. Frank represents childlike loneliness and emotional innocence. The bride represents suppressed rage and the struggle for autonomous identity. The film suggests that neither character can truly belong to the human world. The ghost of Mary Shelley gradually fades from narrative control near the end. This is symbolically significant. At the beginning of the film, Shelley appears as a controlling authorial voice shaping the story. By the ending, her presence dissolves. This can be interpreted in two ways. The story has outgrown its creator. The characters have achieved narrative independence. It is a meta-commentary on storytelling itself. The relationship between Bride and Frank is not presented as survival romance. Instead, it is closer to tragic gothic companionship. The film suggests that love between two damaged beings does not necessarily heal them. Rather, it allows them to recognize their own monstrosity without shame. People are turned into monsters when society refuses to allow them autonomy, empathy, or recognition. The bride's journey is not about becoming human, it is about choosing who she is, even if that identity exists outside human social structures. The film never asks whether the bride becomes happy. Instead, it asks something more unsettling. Is freedom possible if the world itself is built to reject you?